Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on Bill C-50, an act to amend the Canada Elections Act respecting political financing. Mr. Speaker, Bill C-50, more particularly, would require certain public notification and reporting in respect of certain political fundraising events. In that regard, Bill C-50 would require that where a cabinet minister or party leader or leadership candidate attends a political fundraising event and where the ticket price for the event is more than $200, that public notification would be required and that a report would be sent to Elections Canada on the event. Now, the government has sold this bill as a bill to increase transparency, accountability, and to strengthen Canada's political financing laws. I say that one should not buy into the bill of goods that this government is trying to sell Canadians, because, Mr. Speaker, this bill is not about increased transparency. It's not about increased accountability. It's not about strengthening Canada's political financing laws. Rather, what Bill C-50 is about is legitimizing and sanitizing this government and the Liberal Party's sordid cash-for-access racket. That's what Bill C-50, Mr. Speaker, is about.
That's right.
Now, why would the government, by way of legislation, seek to legitimize cash for access? Well, as my colleague, the honourable member for Banff-Airdrie, has pointed out, this government has found its hand caught in the cookie jar one too many times. This government has been caught with their hand in the cookie jar inasmuch as the Prime Minister has said one thing and then done another. We have a Prime Minister who, after all, more or less disavowed cash for access fundraising and then proceeded to engage in cash for access fundraising. And not only engaged in cash for access fundraising, but perfected cash for access fundraising. You know, Mr. Speaker, to understand the degree to which the Prime Minister broke his word with the Canadian public, one need look back to the 2015 election, when he's told Canadians, elect me, and I will deliver the most open, the most transparent, and the most accountable government in Canadian history. And to try to demonstrate that he meant what he said and said what he meant, the Prime Minister, upon appointing his cabinet, unveiled a document called Open and Accountable Government. Open and accountable government was the code of conduct, the standards of conduct by which the Prime Minister said he and his ministers and parliamentary secretaries would be held to. And open and accountable government actually did deal with sets of standards of conduct for cabinet ministers, for the Prime Minister, and for parliamentary secretaries, specifically relating to political fundraising. And I think it's important to speak to and review some of what open and accountable government said, just to understand, just again, how blatantly and how flagrantly this Prime Minister has broken his word with the Canadian people. Open and accountable government says, among other things, quote, ministers and parliamentary secretaries must avoid conflict of interest, the appearance of conflict of interest, and situations that have the potential to involve conflicts of interest, unquote. But it gets better, Mr. Speaker. It says, further, quote, there should be no preferential access to government or appearance of preferential access. And moreover, open and accountable government states that department stakeholders, including lobbyists, should not be targeted for the solicitation of political funds. That's what open and accountable government said. That's the standard the Prime Minister set for himself and his cabinet. And so it begs the question, what did the Prime Minister do following issuing that standard? The answer is that the Prime Minister ignored open and accountable government. It was as if open and accountable government had never been written. He, as my friend, the member for Barrie Innisfil, said, it wasn't worth the paper that it was written on, because almost immediately the Prime Minister doubled down with cash for access event after cash for access event after cash for access event. Indeed, in 2016, the Liberal Party held more than 100 cash for access events. Cash for access events, like one held in May of 2016 in Toronto, with none other than Mr. Sanctimony himself, the Prime Minister, who was there with, at the residence of a Chinese billionaire. There were other Chinese billionaires, each of whom paid $1,500 to the Liberal Party of Canada, and there they had an evening with the Prime Minister making dumplings and having the ear of the Prime Minister, and I'm sure spending a wonderful evening with him. Among those in attendance was none other than the chief investor in the Wealth One Bank, a bank that was seeking a banking license in Canada at the time of the Cash for Access fundraiser. What a sweet deal, Mr. Speaker. $1,500 to the Liberal Party and an opportunity to spend the evening with the Prime Minister to talk about Wealth One Bank. And sure enough, the license got approved. At the very same event, there was a Chinese communist official who wasn't a Canadian citizen, so he couldn't send the money directly to the Liberal Party. But the Liberal Party said to him, don't worry about it. And so 2 weeks later, that very same individual wrote a $200,000 check to the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation. I guess we're supposed to just assume that it was a coincidence that he spends the evening with the Prime Minister and 2 weeks later, just out of coincidence, decides to write a $200,000 check to the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my friend for Barrie Innisfil says you can't make it up. Well, you really can't, because it's just incredible. It speaks to the hypocrisy. It speaks to the lack of ethical conduct on the part of this government. And so here we are today with Bill C-50. What does it do? Well, it requires public notification 5 days before an event. I say big deal to that, Mr. Speaker. It goes on to require reporting to Elections Canada of an event. I don't know if it occurred to this government, but every single political contribution is already reported to Elections Canada. So in terms of substantive improvements to political financing laws in Canada, this bill falls short. It is nothing more than smoke and mirrors so that the Prime Minister can pretend that he is doing something about political financing, all the while giving himself a blank check to engage in the most sordid types of political fundraising activities. Mr. Speaker, this is a cynical bill, and Canadians deserve more than a cynical bill from a cynical and ethically challenged government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Minister for Democratic Institutions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I can absolutely say that, this is not a cynical bill. This is a bill that is making a substantial difference. And, it's unfortunate to hear from my colleague across the way on this topic in such a cynical manner. Because to be perfectly honest, fundraising is activities that all political parties undertake. And I want to make one correction. The first one is we know that no foreigner can make a contribution. It's against the law, and that's something that all political parties uphold. The second thing is that it's actually reporting of who attended events, when they took place, and where they took place. And this is important because this is information Canadians didn't have before. C-50 aims to make fundraising events more open and transparent, and all I was hearing from the opposition is that they don't believe in more openness nor more transparency. We know for a fact the leader of the official opposition was, of course, holding fundraising events in secret this summer and refused to provide details. So my question to my honourable colleague is, does he not believe more openness and transparency about fundraising is a good thing? Because that's exactly what this bill aims to do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I think we have absolutely no lessons to learn from this government, because the consistent record of this government is to say one thing and do another. It's they who issued open and accountable government, and it is they that almost immediately flagrantly violated their own ethical standards. I remember standing in this House day in and day out in April of 2016 asking the Minister of Justice about the pay-to-play fundraiser at Tories LLP in Toronto, an event that was attended by lawyers and lobbyists, an event that was advertised as an opportunity for attendees to engage with the minister on matters that pertain directly to her role as Minister of Justice. Right. That's called pay-to-play. That's called giving preferential access. That is called giving the perception of a conflict of interest. It was right in open and accountable government, and instead of taking responsibility for it, the minister wouldn't stand in her place and defend herself, leaving it to the then government House leader, and she was given forewarning about the fact that she was breaching the standard that the Prime Minister set, and she went anyway. So she thumbed her nose. And that's what the Prime Minister has done. He's thumbed his nose because he believes he's above the rules. Right. They don't apply to him. Right. They apply to everyone else, but he and his ministers, it's absolutely
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Victoria.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague from Edmonton, St. Albert, for his usual eloquent speech today. He was accused of cynicism. I think one can do better, Mr. Speaker. I called this the Bait and Switch Act, where it looks like they're going after cash for access, but no, we're going to go for transparency. And now we all can know that there's cash for access. And I also called it the Lobbyist Despair Act, because now why would you have to hire a fancy lobbying firm in Ottawa when you can go right to the minister, right to the Prime Minister, and ask about that job for your brother-in-law or that contract for your firm? So through you, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask my honourable colleague whether he would agree with me that the government's claim that somehow that's exactly the same for government members who actually give contracts and opposition members who don't is, in fact, a joke.
Honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Speaker, I thank the member for Victoria, and I would simply agree. It is an absolute joke. And for the government to try to conflate the power vested in ministers with a leader of an opposition party is simply a very, very different context, a very different set of circumstances. I see the member for Beaches East York is in the House, and it reminds me, in terms of how this government operates, when he had a fundraiser with the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Justice, the point man on marijuana. Lobbyists for the marijuana industry showed up. One of them was quoted in the Globe and Mail as saying that she really would have preferred if she could have sat down with him, but if you have to pay a few $100s to be there, I guess that's what I have to do. This is how the Liberal Party operates. It's a real shame.